Did you know? Instead of using a magical conductor's baton, Link was originally planned to control the wind using a theremin. This alien-sounding instrument was accidentally invented by a Soviet radio engineer in 1920. Leon Theremin was trying to make something else entirely, but ended up with the world's first major electronic instrument. Instead of touching it, the musician leaves their hands floating above it. One hand controls the frequency, and the other controls the amplitude. But how exactly did this almost get into a Zelda game? A movie about Leon Theremin had just come out in Japan, about how he invented the instrument, traveled the world playing it, became a Soviet spy, and got thrown in the gulags. And it turns out that a few Nintendo devs saw the movie and thought, hey, that's an interesting story, let's have Link play a theremin in the next Zelda game. To control the instrument, players would have held their GameCube controller like this, with the analog and C sticks each representing one of Link's hands playing the theremin. The game's title comes from the primary instrument, so up until halfway into development, the theremin itself was the Wind Waker. This was all explained by the game's director Eiji Aonuma in a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream we recently had translated, and they joke that the game could have been called The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Theremin. For this video, we delved into hundreds of magazines looking for cut content and obscure facts about the Wind Waker, and ended up translating several magazines and some online interviews into English for the first time. We want to keep going the extra mile to get new and interesting facts for you guys, and if you want to see more of it too, leave a like on this video. It really helps us out. So anyway, Aonuma and his team were all set with a Zelda game based around a theremin. Then Shigeru Miyamoto came in for playtesting and, as he tends to do, upended the tea table. According to Aonuma, he'd play what we made and point out what was weird. We had the Wind Waker item ready to some extent, when Miyamoto came to me shaking his head saying no, no, no. He talked about how it was entirely unacceptable. We were using both sticks at first, adjusting with both hands like how you play a theremin. By moving both hands like this, then the magazine notes that Aonuma aims his palms down and moves his hands up and down, you could change the sound. But eventually we changed it to the baton, and everything else fell into place from there. By the way, a big thanks to Daniel Romberger for making this demonstration for us, so we can see and hear a theremin in action. Check out his channel for more Nintendo remixes. Miyamoto also changed Wind Waker's difficulty. It was initially harder, but a lot of Ocarina and Majora players got stuck on bosses and never got to experience the full game. So, to make sure everyone could reach the ending, Miyamoto toned down the difficulty, especially the bosses, compared to how the Zelda team originally had it set. When the HD remaster released a decade later, they added Hero Mode to compensate. But Aonuma said even though he's the director, this new mode was too hard even for him. He got stuck on Goma and gave up, then asked his team if the difficulty he was experiencing was some sort of bug, and they were like, no. Another aspect that Miyamoto wasn't keen on was Wind Waker's art style. Initially, Nintendo was just going to improve on the graphics from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and they even built a prototype in that style. But later on in the conceptual phase, the Zelda team's artist proposed Toon Link. The rest of the team loved it, and dove headfirst into the cel-shaded art style. Aonuma didn't think Miyamoto would like it, so he waited till they were already in pretty deep to show it to him. And he was right. Miyamoto literally cringed, and didn't think it would sell. Aonuma recalls, "If I had gone and talked to him from the very beginning, I think he would have said, 'How is that Zelda?'" Miyamoto had trouble letting go of the realistic Link art style until the very end. At some point, he had to give a presentation against his will. That's when he said something to me like, "You know, it's not too late to change course and make a realistic Zelda." But the team was super enthusiastic about the new style and insisted they didn't want to give it up. It was inspired by the anime they watched as kids, especially Hayao Miyazaki's Animal Treasure Island. And Aonuma says Wind Waker's kind of unique in the way it doesn't feel like a Zelda game. It's more of an adventure across the sea where the main character just happens to be Link. And for that reason, the story was also kept from Miyamoto for quite a long time. Miyamoto really wasn't thrilled with the situation, but ultimately accepted it because with the team they had, it would have taken 10 years to make a realistic Zelda, but a Toon Zelda could be made in a fraction of the time. But before we cover even more exclusive Wind Waker facts not found anywhere else, a word word from this episode's sponsor, Buy. If you've ever used American sites to buy things from Japan, you've probably noticed how much sellers jack up the price. It can be a lot. This is where Buy comes in. Buy is a service that places orders or bids on your behalf on Japanese shopping and auction sites, then ships the items straight to you without any absurd price hikes. This includes sites like Rakuten, Amazon Japan, and Yahoo Japan Auction. So if you've been wanting to get a hold of a Japanese game or piece of merch, but don't want to pay insane rates, this service will let you get your hands on the stuff for a more affordable price. Buy is easy to use and offers support in several languages, which of course includes English. They also ship worldwide, including to North America, Europe, and Oceania. Buy has over half a dozen international shipping methods, multiple payment methods, and 4 different insurance plans to match your needs. Buy is also giving DidYouKnowGaming viewers a 2,000 yen first-time purchase coupon for signing up through the link below. So if you want to try out this great service and get 2,000 yen off your first order, check out Buy by using our link below. And now, back to Wind Waker. Most other Zelda titles make you feel like you're Link, but in Wind Waker, the team tried to make it feel more like you're guiding Link, almost as if you're watching an anime. In other words, he's his own entity outside the player's inputs. This separation was emphasized with Link's eyes. He looks around independently of the player's actions and what the player sees. In early builds shown to the public, Link's eyes were solid black, but a fan from Europe sent in a letter saying black eyes made Europeans uncomfortable. In response, Miyamoto said, his eyes would change between 7 different colors. We made it so his eyes were temporarily red in battle, then blue when he calms down, and green when he's talking to people, and things like that. But ultimately we realized a human with red eyes is kind of creepy, isn't it? So at that point, we just decided to give up on the idea. Ultimately, they looked at Mario's blue eyes and said, let's just make Link's eyes blue and call it a day. Fan letters continued pouring in, especially from girls asking to get rid of the Toon Link altogether. Lots of girls demanded in no uncertain terms that they bring back the stud from Ocarina, the teenage heartthrob they fell in love with 5 years earlier, but Nintendo ignored them. Wind Waker's timeline placement changed as well. Miyamoto said they initially placed it at the very beginning, before the other Zelda games, but shortly after release, Aonuma said they'd changed it to take place 100 years after Ocarina of Time, a fact reflected in the game's story. Probably the biggest changes in development were for the sea itself. According to Aonuma, we wanted to do away with the Hyrule we'd had so far. We didn't want to just remake the same Hyrule from the N64, so what could we do? How about we just sync the whole thing? At first, we had plans for primary and alternate worlds like A Link to the Past, where you could go back and forth between present and past Hyrule, but we couldn't make something like that in the limited time we had. In A Link to the Past, you can warp back and forth between the Light World, where most of the game takes place, and a dark, twisted version of Hyrule called the Dark World. Wind Waker would have used a similar mechanic, but instead of the Dark World, Link would have explored underwater Hyrule. This concept art in the Hyrule Historia gives us a better look at how they were thinking that might have worked, with Link using a key item to warp down to the lower world. To get back to the upper world, Link would have grabbed onto hooks belonging to fishermen who'd yank him up back to the surface. Wind Waker spent 1 year in the planning stages, which gave them time to decide which parts of the Great Sea lined up with parts of Ocarina's Hyrule, but Nintendo only gave them 1.5 years in actual production. So unfortunately, the team simply didn't have enough time to fully implement their ideas, and the only underwater location they could include was Hyrule Castle. They also wanted to make the ocean a lot smaller, but according to Aonuma, part of the reason the sea's so vast is because if we made it smaller, there wouldn't be enough time to process the data for whatever island you were heading towards. We had to strike a good balance with the boat's speed for the same reason. In the middle of development, we wanted to make the boat go faster, but doing that meant the game couldn't read all the data, and it froze a lot. As a result, the ocean ended up bigger than they wanted, and some fans thought getting from island to island took too long, which is why they eventually added a swift sail in the HD remaster. In the final game, if you reach the edge of the ocean, the boat says you can't go any farther and forces you to U-turn. But the Zelda team originally thought of making the ocean continuous to simulate the world being round, like how the world works in Skies of Arcadia, a Dreamcast game that launched while Wind Waker was in its planning stage. That way, if you sail off the right side side of the map, you'd suddenly appear on the left side, or if you keep going up, you'll come out at the bottom. But they ended up scrapping that idea for story purposes. Wind Waker was brand new when this magazine interview took place, so the developers didn't want to reveal too much about the plot. But they did say you'll understand why they didn't make the world round when you see the game's ending. They're probably alluding to Wind Waker's final moments, when Link and Zelda sail off into the distance, looking for a land that'll become the next Hyrule. If the game's ocean was round and continuous, that would have implied the game world was in the entire world, meaning Link and Zelda would never find the land they were looking for. In other words, a cool gameplay concept was scrapped for the sake of the story. Speaking of Wind Waker's ending, a direct sequel was originally planned for GameCube, which would have seen Toon Link riding a horse around on the Great Plains. So it seems Link and Tetra would have discovered the land they were looking for, but Wind Waker's sales fell so far below expectations that Nintendo decided to make Twilight Princess instead. Ubisoft staff also tried making a Wind Waker sequel for Game Boy Advance, but the project got canned after just 1 month. And in 2007, Aonuma said he wanted to make a new Wind Waker for Wii, but knew he wouldn't be able to swing it, presumably due to the disappointing sales of the original. Toon Link did eventually get a couple more adventures on Nintendo DS, but there was actually one more game with Toon Link that did get made, but never came to the West. Tetris Trackers was a GameCube spin-off game released in 2004. The story picks up right where Wind Waker left off, with Link now trying to prove he's got what it takes to join Tetra's crew and become a bona fide pirate. It was announced at E3 2003, and was originally planned for worldwide release as a standalone GameCube game, but during the last year of development, it got shrunk down and included with Four Swords Adventures, but only in the Japanese and Korean versions of the game. There it was called Navi Trackers, but since the English title was announced as Tetris Trackers, that's what we're gonna call it. Tetris Trackers was never localized into any other languages, probably because it would have been difficult with the game's full voice acting. Have a listen and you'll see what we mean. Tetris Trackers never even got a fan translation, so we translated parts of it and added subtitles for use in this video. And it didn't just feature Tetra. A huge cast of Wind Waker characters make an appearance, and they talk constantly. Even minor characters like Sue Bell from Outset Island. The sploosh guy Salvatore has his own voice, and also does some impressions. But probably the most disconcerting voice comes from the King of Red Lions. We won't go over all the characters, but there's a lot of them, which would have made localizing Tetris Trackers pretty tricky. And since it had already been relegated to just being a part of Four Swords, it probably wouldn't have been all that profitable. So how does the game actually work? In Four Swords Adventures, you plug up to 4 Game Boy Advances into your GameCube. Most of the gameplay takes place on the TV screen, and occasionally look down at their GBA screen if they go into a house or something. But in Tetris Trackers, most of the gameplay takes place on the GBA, and you occasionally look up at the TV to see the map or other miscellaneous information. It's basically a treasure hunting party game. Each player, represented by a different colored Link, runs through maze-like stages searching for pirates, stamps, medals, seashells, rupees. Everything's worth a certain number of points, and whoever's got the most points after 9 minutes wins. There's also a single-player mode where you compete against Tingle. That's the short explanation. It'd probably take 15 minutes to explain it all in depth, and there's some development background as well, so we'll save that for a future video. Make sure and subscribe if you don't want to miss it. But for the purpose of today's video, besides the funny voices and visuals, we also wanted to point out that Tetris Trackers fits into the Zelda timeline right here. It's Link's initiation into Tetra's gang of pirates, right between Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass. But whether or not it's considered canon is controversial among fans, especially after it got bundled with Four Swords Adventures, which stars another Link who lives in a different timeline. Four Swords definitely is canon, but since there's 2 Links on one disc, and Tetris Trackers only released in Japanese, some fans refuse to acknowledge it. But even the developers don't think too much about the timeline and what is or isn't canon, so trying to find a definitive answer is probably overthinking it. Either way, it's certainly an interesting chapter in the life and times of Toon Link. Okay, let's get back to those magazines we translated. The whole staff talks about how glad they were to finally finish Wind Waker and how much crunch was required to get the game out on time. Looking back right after launch, they said, "It was painful when we were making it. We really couldn't go home or see our kids. When everyone came into work in the morning, I'd move from where I slept on the 3rd floor to my workstation on the 5th floor, and then go back to the 3rd floor at night. I had no idea what was happening in the outside world." Aonuma wasn't even aware winter had arrived, adding, "I saw some guys in the office wearing down jackets and thought, what's up with these guys? When I eventually got to go home, I was surprised to see how cold it had gotten." Even with all that crunch, Wind Waker's short year-and-a-half development meant they just didn't have enough time to include everything they would have liked. Aonuma says the very last thing they were working on when the clock struck midnight was the crabs. In the final game, they're tiny and don't really do anything except run away and dig into the sand. But the Zelda team wanted to make them 10 times their normal size and much more interactive. Nintendo Dream Magazine makes a point of Aonuma's regretful tone as he tells them, "We were going to have crabs on the shore and do lots of things with them, but in the end we couldn't make it happen. We were thinking about what to do with the crabs when development ended. Sorry about the crabs." He also laments how the boat turned out. In the final game, if you're on the boat, equipping the bombs makes a cannon appear, and the grapple hook turns into a crane for dredging up treasure. But Aonuma says they wanted to add a lot more tools for the boat, but didn't have enough time. They probably could have implemented at least one more, if it wasn't for one guy on the Zelda team who vastly overestimated the American education system. Aonuma said, "I've never sailed a ship before, and I thought sailboats couldn't move against the direction of the wind. But someone who's actually been on a yacht told me, if a boat zigzags, it can still sail against the wind," which was the first I'd ever heard of that. I was told, "This is something everyone in America learns in high school, and if you don't get it right, there are definitely going to be complaints. So I thought we couldn't cut corners there." The extra time spent on the zigzagging boat meant less time was left for other items. Previous Zelda games always had a nice variety of mini-games, like the shooting gallery and bomb-chew bowling. The team wanted to add some into Wind Waker too, like an island where Link can play golf. Unfortunately though, time was so tight that Aonuma had to give the order to abandon the idea. But as they were nearing the deadline, they came into the office one morning and were shocked to see the golf island somehow appeared out of nowhere. Aonuma said someone must have snuck in after hours and built it themselves, without anyone else on the team knowing. Sadly though, a lot of other mini-games weren't so lucky, and along with 2 entire dungeons, ultimately got left out of the final game. One thing that did make it in was the Sploosh game on Windfall Island, which was demanded by Nintendo's old-timers, which kinda makes sense since it's based on Battleship, an old board game that boomers played when they were kids. Aonuma even had to ban the strategy guide team from playing it because he was afraid they'd get obsessed and never get around to playing the rest of the game. In the original Japanese version, Salvatore's game is literally about sinking battleships. But when Wind Waker was localized for an international audience, they changed it into a squid game. And when the HD remaster released a decade later, they used the squid version in every region, including Japan. But these aren't the only secrets we dug up on Wind Waker. According to Aonuma and Haruhana, the Deku Leaf was originally a paper fan. Its only purpose was fanning things, but later in development they came up with the idea for Link to use it to fly around in the wind, so they changed it into a leaf. If you ever wondered how deep underwater old Hyrule was, Aonuma provides an answer in one of these magazines. He says, "We limited the sense of how deep it is because of the crane. It's fairly easy to go to Hyrule as well. It's deep enough to fully hide a person, and then a little deeper still." He might be referring to its canonical depth and not its actual depth though, because in his Boundary Break episode, YouTuber She Says moved the camera to get a visual of the depth, which made it look to be around 40 feet. The only part of Hyrule you actually get to visit is the castle, which is definitely deeper than both those estimates, but that's probably because it's at the bottom of a chasm. Another interesting fact is that every item in Wind Waker had its name translated in Wind Waker's English release, except for one, the Hioi pear. As pointed out by Aonuma in one of these magazines, the fruit gets its name from Hioi, the Japanese word for possession, as in being possessed like how a spirit takes control of a person's body. So if they translated the Hioi pair, it would have been the possession pair, which apparently they didn't think the Western audience could handle. Well, probably the Western audience's parents, if you know what I mean. One of the younger devs, Toshiaki Suzuki, was selected as Wind Waker's, quote, Tingle specialist. Working on Tingle and his fairy buddies was his entire job for quite some time. One of his coworkers said, "From dusk till dawn, he thought about nothing but Tingle. It drove him crazy." In all these magazines, Toshiaki's only given one brief opportunity to speak, which he uses to say, "I've been thinking about nothing but Tingle for these last few months, so please, experience adventuring together with Tingle. The rare blue Tingle is on Outset Island, ... What he's talking about is the rarest character in the whole game, and most people who've played Wind Waker never even knew he existed. Knuckle is Tingle's little brother. He carved the entirety of Tingle Tower by himself when he was just 10 years old. Then Tingle came along and put up a sign that said "For Tingle Only," which made Knuckle so mad that he ran away to Outlet Island. The only way you can ever see Knuckle in the GameCube version is by plugging in a Game Boy Advance and going to Outset, which triggers an argument between the two fairy brothers. Then you play a mini-game to unlock the hand-me-down Tingle Tuner, an item only found in the GameCube version that lets you buy arrows, bombs, and bait anytime you want through the GBA. Finding Knuckle is such a hassle that the game actually considers your figurine collection complete if you manage to get all of them except Knuckle. Speaking of Knuckle's figurine, its description features an interesting secret. It says his studio is inside the head of Tingle Tower. It's impossible to get inside the tower's head through any normal means, but it is possible if you hack the game, and by the looks of it, it seems the Tingle specialist really did go crazy. Just look at this place. Since the HD remaster couldn't hook up with a Game Boy Advance, most of Knuckles' content got cut. The argument, the minigame, and even the hand-me-down Tingle Tuner he gives you. But he will appear on Tingle Island after you get the 5 Tingle statues, and Knuckles' figure now is required to complete the full collection. It's been updated to say, supposedly it used to bother him that this collection was considered complete, even without his figurine. And if you're worried about that Tingle specialist who went crazy, don't worry. Things worked out pretty well for him. He immediately got promoted to director and made Four Swords Adventures, and nowadays he's producer on the Mario Party series. Did you also know that Ubisoft tried to make a Wind Waker sequel for Game Boy Advance, and the Zelda team wanted to make a Twilight Princess sequel on Wii? For these facts and more, check out the video on screen. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and maybe share it with a friend. Huge thanks to Eurasia M for recording all of Tetris Trackers for us, Danny Music for the theremin cover, and all the folks who made today's video possible. And thanks to everyone at home for watching. See you next time.